The Indian sky was dazzling azure. Not a single cloud darkened the vault of heaven. Birds sang on the branches among the new leaves that were blooming, and the crocuses, daffodils were in bloom. It seemed as if all nature had united in some sinister conspiracy to mock my grief. I got into the back seat of my son's car, and we slowly drove out of the cemetery. Sally turned in her seat to look at me sympathetically. She reached across the seat and squeezed my hand. "It was a beautiful ceremony, Mr. Moore. I know Madeline would have loved it." I said nothing. Maddie was a happy person, someone who loved nature. Or at least she was before Grace left. Terry looked at me, and I saw that his eyes were red too, but he was trying to be supportive. "Sally's right, Dad. Mom would want things to be like they were today." I knew they were right. Spring was Maddie's favorite time of year. I think if she had to leave, she would choose this time. But this is little consolation when you have just buried the wife you loved for 35 years. Terry parked in front of our house, and he and Sally walked into the house with me. I sat down heavily on the sofa. They looked at me worriedly. "Have you heard anything from Grace?" I asked. Terry looked at the floor. "No, not a word." I nodded. I was sure of the answer, but could not resist asking. In the silence, Terry shifted uncomfortably and then asked, "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" How to answer this, I asked myself. Nothing will be okay anymore, but I can't tell my son that. It will only increase his worry about me, and he has his own grief to deal with. "I'll be fine," I told him. "It's going to be pretty weird living here without her, but I plan on keeping busy, and that will help." "That's good, Dad," Terry replied. "Listen, we need to pick up Lance from the babysitter. But if you need anything, please call me." I stood up to see them off and nodded. "You two take care of my grandson," I told them. After they left, I stood and looked around the house that Maddie and I had shared for so many years. It was full of memories, some good, some not so good, but he was always full of life, and now, well, not quite so much. The day was still bright outside, but the light coming through the windows seemed to lose its intensity as it entered. I sat down again and began to remember. My thoughts went back to when we bought this house all those years ago. In fact, it was too big and expensive for a young couple like us just starting out in life, but we fell in love with this place at first sight, and no other place would have been suitable. So we pulled all our savings out of the bank, and my dad borrowed me enough to make a down payment. Even then, the monthly payment was more than I could comfortably handle, so Maddie went looking for a job. She was lucky to find one in the development department of the City Art Museum. She had always been good at communication, both written and verbal, and with her love of art, it was the perfect job. I guess you could say we were household poor. We had very little money left over each month after paying the mortgage and utilities. But it didn't matter to us. We were madly in love and on our way to the American dream. We might not have gone to restaurants or movies, but we made up for it by making love in every room of the house. With so much sex, it was no surprise that Maddie became pregnant with Terry the second year after we settled into our new home. The birth was difficult. Maddie was in labor for 18 hours, but then we had this wonderful new life in our hands, and suddenly everything was perfect. Terry was a good baby, sleeping through the night at 6 weeks, no colic, no problems that many newborns experience. As he grew, he continued to exhibit the same good health and happy disposition, so much so that Maddie felt comfortable returning to work when Terry was 9 months old. The museum valued her enough to keep her job, so we made it through the transition with surprisingly little difficulty. Having a baby in the house certainly limited our sex life, but only slightly. We were still making love often when Terry started sleeping through the night, and whenever Maddie had to travel on one of her charity trips to other cities, she returned home with a fever. I knew I wouldn't get much sleep the first night after she returned. Terry arrived quite early in our marriage, but it was 5 years before the next child. Maddie wanted to wait. Part of her decision was based on the success she enjoyed in her job. By then, she had been promoted to Director of Development, and she loved every part of her job. communicating with wealthy donors, planning philanthropic events, and running the annual membership drive. But I also think that Terry's birth was so scary that she just wasn't ready to go through it again anytime soon. In fact, we didn't even try when Maddie got pregnant again. But as every doctor knows, children tend to appear when they want, regardless of their parents' intentions. And then Grace arrived almost exactly 5 years after Terry. But unlike her brother, and despite her name, Grace was a challenge from the moment she was born. She cried when she was born, and it seemed like she never stopped crying except when she slept, which happened sporadically and only for short periods of time. We were secretly proud of how well Terry did and what an easy baby he was. Grace humbled us. She cried, spit up, had diarrhea, and then cried again. We were on the edge many times, but somehow got through it with our sanity and marriage intact. I think it was harder for Maddie than for me. Somehow it happened that Grace was on her best behavior when I was holding her, feeding her, or changing her diapers. But when Maddie took her, little Grace struggled and cried and was generally at her worst. She was almost 9 months old before she started sleeping through the night. The pediatrician told us that some babies are just more difficult than others. If so, then Grace was the poster child for the problem. As she got older, we noticed that her personality was very different from her brother's. While Terry was calm and quickly absorbed in his activities, Grace was constantly active, often switching attention from one thing to another, needing attention and demanding to be distracted with something new. When she turned 2, we learned the true meaning of the terrible 2-year-olds. To make matters worse, she never seemed to move out of this stage, even when she reached 3 years of age and beyond. No became her favorite word, and she turned out to be stubborn and adamant. "Are you sure we brought the right baby back from the hospital?" Maddie asked me in the evenings when Grace was especially difficult. Another striking difference between our two children was in their academics. From the very beginning, Terry exhibited the drive to achieve that characterizes firstborn children. As my father would say, he clung to his studies like a pig to mud. He was not a genius, but he was a good student who always worked hard, and all his teachers praised him at parent-teacher conferences. Unlike him, Grace was indifferent to her studies. This doesn't mean she was slow. In fact, she was very smart, perhaps even smarter than Terry. If she liked a subject, she would immerse herself in it, often getting top marks in the class. But she had no interest or patience for subjects she didn't like, and it was almost impossible to get her to devote time or effort to them. As a result, she excelled in certain areas but failed in all others, significantly lowering her overall grades. Maddie and I feared the time when Grace would reach adolescence, and our fears came true. The rebellion and independence that burned within her as a child became a blazing fire when she turned 13, and things only got worse. She was brash, sassy, and often disobedient. Despite all this, Grace graduated from school, and although she did not excel in her studies, she still received a certificate. Her diploma didn't qualify her for admission to Harvard, but at least she had the opportunity to attend a community college and possibly transfer to a better university after her sophomore year. At least that was our plan. But her achievement has lulled us into a false sense of optimism. Soon after graduation, Grace and her mother had a big fight. I wasn't there when it all started, so I don't know who threw the first verbal punch, but I heard screams and walked into the room just in time to hear Maddie scream, "I'm your mother, and I won't tolerate that kind of disrespect from you, young lady." To which my daughter responded with equal volume, "You are not my mother, you are a bitch." Maddie and I were stunned, but before either of us could react, Grace burst into tears and ran to her room upstairs. I heard the door slam, and when I tried to open the handle, it was locked. I knew I could open her door with the master key, but I decided it was better to let her cool down rather than cause an immediate confrontation. Now I regret not choosing another option. We didn't see Grace the rest of the day, which was just as well because Maddie was almost hysterical. I had to devote all my strength to comforting and reassuring her as best I could. Grace didn't come down for dinner, so we assumed she was on the phone with her friends, complaining about how badly her parents treated her. After the stolen car incident, I made sure all the car keys were in our room and checked them before going to bed. I didn't sleep well and got up twice during the night to make sure Grace was still at home. Sometime after midnight, I fell into a restless sleep. When I finally woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was go to Grace's room. I was relieved to see that her door was still closed and turned to go back to our bedroom. But something made me check again, and when I tried the door handle, it swung open. Her room was as chaotic as ever, but Grace was not in bed. I quickly ran downstairs and checked the rest of the house. No Grace. Then I went to the garage to make sure the cars were still there. They were there. I returned to the house, intending to wake Maddie and inform her of my discovery, when I noticed my wallet lying on the table in the breakfast room. I was sure I had left it on my dresser the night before. When I opened it, I noticed two things. I withdrew $500 from the bank at the beginning of the week. Now they are gone. Then I saw a note folded where the bills were. I recognized Grace's scrawl. "Sorry, Daddy, I took the money. I'll give it back to you someday." I quickly took the phone and called the police. "I want to report a missing person," I told the desk sergeant. He wanted to know her age and how long she had been missing. When I told him that she was 18 and had only left a few hours ago, he wearily explained that she was an adult and could come and go as she pleased, and in any case, she could not be considered missing until more than 24 hours have passed, unless there is evidence of a crime. I decided not to mention the money Grace took. Maddie came down in the middle of my conversation, and when she understood the essence of the discussion, she began hysterically tugging at my sleeve to find out what was going on. I took out the note from Grace and gave it to her. She started crying when she read it. I returned to the phone. "Look, Sergeant, I don't know if you have children, but if you did and one of them ran away like that, what would you do?" There was a pause, and his voice lost all its indifference and became human. "The first thing I would do is call all her friends and see if they know where she might be going. If that doesn't yield any results, I would check the bus station to see if she bought a ticket. Many fugitives do this because it's cheap and doesn't cause problems at the door. And if you haven't already, try calling her phone. If she doesn't answer, leave her a message." I thanked him and hung up. I wonder if he has a daughter Grace's age. I called Grace on her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. "Grace," I said, as calmly as I could under the circumstances, "please come home. I'm so scared for you, baby. If you can't come back, I'll come get you, wherever you are. If you don't want to come home, at least call and let me know you're okay. Please, baby, Mom and I love you so much, and we're so scared, baby." Maddie and I started calling all of Grace's friends we could think of. No one knew where she might have gone, or if they did, no one would admit it. We called Terry, who had already graduated from college and had a wife, but he hadn't heard from her either. Terry and Grace weren't very close, but they were closer to each other than she was to us. He promised to report immediately if he heard anything. Then we went to the bus station, hoping she was still there. She wasn't there, and none of the people at the ticket counters remembered selling a one-way ticket to an 18-year-old girl. The next few days were a nightmare. After the mandatory 24 hours, we officially reported Grace missing. The police warned us that they could not force her to return home since she was an adult, but they promised to look for her no matter what. We learned about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and enrolled Grace there. We learned about support groups made up of parents missing children. We were horrified to learn that every year some 850,000 new names are added to the missing persons list, nearly two-thirds of whom are under 20 years of age. But we also learned that almost the same number of records are purged each year as people return home or are removed from the list in some way. This gave us hope. I contacted a detective agency to see if they could help. The agent I spoke with was very sympathetic, but not very reassuring. Indianapolis is surrounded by major cities within several hundred miles in each direction, and in each of them there are significant numbers of fugitives and homeless people where she could be lost. Even if we knew where she was going, we would have a hard time finding her if she didn't want to be found. I'll be honest with you, We don't like to take cases like this because it's very rare that we're successful. If I were you, I'd keep doing what you're doing now. You have the same chance of finding her as we do." I left his office a worried and disappointed man. About 2 months after Grace disappeared, I was working in the office when my cell phone rang. "Hello," I answered, and heard a trembling female voice. "Dad?" "Grace," I screamed. "Where are you, baby? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad," she replied. "I'm in a safe place. I just don't want you to worry about me." "Come home, Grace," I begged. "Or tell me where you are, and I'll come get you." "No, I can't, Dad," she said. "It's all too weird. I'll stay where I am." "Oh, baby, please come home. Mommy and I miss you so much." "Sorry, Dad, I can't. Look, I just wanted you to know that I'm okay and you don't have to worry about me. I'll call you again when I can." And with that, she passed out. I left work and went to the museum to see Maddie. I didn't trust myself to tell her over the phone. As I walked into her office, Maddie saw me and raised her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "No, this is good news," I said hastily. "I just received a call from Grace." With these words, Maddie lowered her head to the table and began to sob. I walked around the table to hug her. When she regained control, I told her what happened and what Grace said. "But when will she come home?" Maddie demanded. "She must come home." I sighed. "Honey, she said she was in a safe place and would stay there for now. She said things were too weird for her to go home now." Maddie started crying again. "She hates me," she sobbed. "I kicked her out, and now she's punishing me." "No, honey, no. She's confused and unhappy, and none of us know what's really going on with her. You need to stop blaming yourself. That argument you had wasn't the reason she left. It was just a symptom of all her confusion. You have to believe it." I don't think Maddie accepted my hypothesis, but she calmed down and the two of us were able to find solace in the fact that our daughter was alive and seemed okay. This is how our lifestyle developed. Every few months I would receive a call from Grace, reassuring me that she was fine. She never asked for money, never said where she was, and never agreed to come home no matter how much I begged. Sometimes Terry would tell me that she had called him, always with the same message. But she never called Maddie, and although I tried to gloss over the obvious, I knew it always hurt Maddie that her daughter wouldn't talk to her. We never accepted the situation, but after several years we reached a certain degree of acceptance. Our daughter didn't want us in her life, and there was nothing we could do about it. We were still worried about her, especially when the interval between calls became longer than usual, but wherever she was and whatever she was doing, she seemed to be safe as far as we could tell, and we clung to this belief for the sake of your own mental health. But our relative peace did not last long. A new threat has appeared. Maddie returned home one day from a routine mammogram with the alarming news that the doctor had found a lump. "He wants me to have a biopsy," she told me. I felt a cold sweat break out on me even as I tried to console her. "It's probably nothing, honey. They have to check everything today just in case. You'll see," I said, hugging her. But I don't think she believed my words any more than I did. Somehow, Maddie and I became characters in an ancient Greek tragedy, and the gods seemed to be in a particularly vengeful mood. My sense of doom intensified when we got the results back from the lab. The lump turned out to be malignant, with poorly differentiated cancer cells. Additional tests showed that the cancer had spread to the lymphatic system. I was shocked but knew I had to be strong for Maddie because she would need all the strength she could get. "We will fight this," I told her. "It's not a death sentence. Many women go through this and live happily ever after." Maddie's oncologist was a man of no ceremony. "We'll treat it aggressively," he told us. "I don't want to take this one step at a time and risk this thing slipping away from us." When we learned what aggressively meant, Maddie turned pale, and I thought I would faint for a moment. She had to undergo a mastectomy and lymph node removal, followed by chemotherapy and radiation therapy. We both cried when we got home from the doctor, and I cried again when I had to call Terry and tell him. The next steps in our little drama were filled with scenes of darkness and light. The light came from the support groups we joined and the support of our friends. They helped us keep our spirits up by expressing sympathy and understanding. But the operation and subsequent treatment were very grim. Losing her breasts hit Maddie especially hard. She was a beautiful woman and was always proud of her breasts. This was one of her best features. Although I tried to hide it, the operation also hit me hard. I had always loved her breasts, and the thought of them being disfigured was difficult for me. But I told myself that I needed to grow up and stop feeling sorry for myself. I'm not someone who's fighting for my life, and I wasn't going to do anything other than be positive and cheerful around her. When we beat this, I promised her, you'll be able to have reconstructive surgery. Now they can work miracles. You'll be the envy of all your friends. But when the gods are angry with mortals, they are not appeased by acts of courage and expressions of optimism. When we learned that the cancer had aggressively metastasized to other organs, Maddie lost the will to fight. I don't want to go through another operation, she told me. I don't want any more chemotherapy or radiation. I've been through enough. I begged and begged her not to give up, but she was adamant, and I really couldn't blame her. I saw how weak she was after the surgery, how the toxic chemicals that were put into her body were making her sick. No one could blame her for not wanting to keep going through this with very little chance of success. I thought that maybe there was another factor, although I didn't want to mention it. I was afraid that Maddie saw her cancer as punishment for what happened to Grace. Maddie never talked about it, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was part of the reason she refused further treatment. When we stopped all treatment, things started to change very quickly. Maddie had good days when she seemed almost normal. I remember how we went to a flower show and rejoiced at the pleasure she got from looking at all these flowers. Other days she could barely lift her head, and I could see her strength draining away like water from a cracked glass. In her last days, I transferred her to hospice care. Most of the time, she simply slept in a restless, anxious sleep. When she was awake, she had things she wanted to say, but didn't have the strength to talk for long. Riley, you know that I have always loved you, she told me more than once. It made me sad because I always knew it. There was no reason why she had to continue to convince me. But I simply replied that I knew it and that I had always loved her just as much. On the last day, she woke up again to take my hand. Grace, she asked, and I understood what she was asking. I could only shake my head. Tell her I'm sorry for everything, she muttered before falling asleep again. She never woke up again. Later that night, Cheyne-Stokes' breathing began, and she left. The gods have taken their revenge. I shook myself from my memories and looked around our quiet house. Now that she was buried, there was nothing more I could do for her. It's time to move on with life. These were bold words, but they did not suit my mood. There were times when I wondered how I could continue living after losing the two most important women in my life. But these were only words of self-pity. I had a son and a wife and son who loved and needed me as much as I needed them. Life might have lost its charm, but I had no right to think about giving up. The next few weeks were filled with new wounds and humiliations. The pain came from having to clean up Maddie's things, especially her clothes, makeup, and other personal items. I knew I had to do it. I didn't want them to become a miserable, dusty shrine, but each item I packed had its own memories, and this relatively simple task took me several days. The humiliations were both active and passive actions of the friends, acquaintances, and colleagues with whom I interacted over the next few weeks. The museum where she worked sent a delegation to express its condolences, and while I appreciated the gesture, I knew almost none of these people. The signed calligraphic plaque they gave me was an embarrassment. What was I supposed to do with it? Hang it over the fireplace? A lot of our friends came in to check on me, but they didn't know what to say other than the corny phrases that everyone uses. Likewise, I didn't know what to say in response other than using the same tired responses. The worst part was the people who couldn't think of anything to say and avoided me in their embarrassment. I saw them shake their heads or cast worried glances in my direction, thinking that I wouldn't notice. I don't blame them. Sometimes there's just nothing to say. I started visiting our pastor at church during Maddie's illness, and now that she's gone, I know I need to keep going. Our pastor was a wise and sweet woman who allowed me to pour out my grief in her small office over a cup of tea. In addition to providing spiritual comfort, she proved to have great insight into human nature. She was the one who most helped me overcome my self-pity. But when I came to see her that Friday, I had a new problem to deal with, a problem that both bothered and embarrassed me. After she poured me a cup of tea and settled into her swivel chair, I began my informal confession. I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed that Maddie was alive, but she didn't want to come to me. I was lying in my bed, but I was helpless and could not get up. Maddie just laughed at me and walked out the door without even looking back. I was so angry with her that at that moment I felt like I hated her. I looked at the thoughtful face of the pastor. What's wrong with me? How can I feel like this? She took a sip from her cup and looked at me carefully. Raleigh, what you're feeling is completely normal. Nobody likes to talk about it, but I dare say that most bereaved people feel resentment and anger towards them at one time or another. But how can this be? I demanded. She's dead, for God's sake, and I'm still alive. She should be upset with me, not the other way around. But you don't understand, she said quietly. She left you alone in all your pain and grief. The more you love her, the more you miss her, and the more it hurts you. And the source of all this pain, Maddie. Is it any wonder that you feel some resentment towards someone who makes you suffer and grieve so much? What she said made sense in a twisted way, but I still didn't like it. What can I do to make this go away? I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating my dead wife. The pastor smiled at me. You don't have to worry about it, Rayleigh. The reason you're feeling angry now is because you haven't yet accepted the fact that Maddie is gone. It's still too fresh and painful. When you reach the point of acceptance, you'll find that the anger is also gone and you can focus on the good memories. As I left her office, I hoped she was right. It was very unpleasant to discover that I hated the woman I had adored for so long. I was glad that I had a meeting with our pastor that day because I was invited to dinner with Terry and his family that evening. The last thing I wanted to do was visit them with unresolved anger in my heart. Little did I know that the next scene in my drama was just beginning. After dinner, Terry and I sat in the living room. Sally left us alone on purpose, saying she needed to put Lance to bed. What happened, Terry? I asked him. I see that you want to tell me something. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and cleared his throat. This is Grace, he said. I heard from her. At that moment, all the anger that the pastor had been able to relieve during the day came back, but this time she had a new purpose. Did you tell her? I demanded. Did you tell her that her mother was dead? He looked at me worriedly. Yes, Dad, I told her. Well, what did she say? I asked louder than I intended. She knew Maddie was dying. Couldn't she even come to her mother's funeral? She cried when I told her, Terry replied. I looked at him expectantly. There's something else, isn't there? I urged. His face took on a guilty expression. She made me swear I wouldn't tell you, Dad, but I just can't keep that promise. I know where she is. I sat in amazement. After 5 long years, Terry continued. When I told her about my mother's death, she asked me to send her something from my mother's crosses that she could keep for herself. I took one in from my mother's crosses from things that which you gave to Sally and sent to her. Dad, she lives in Chicago. I got her address. He handed me a piece of paper. Oh, and she lives under her mom's maiden name. She's Grace Campbell now. I took the paper with her name and address on it and saw that Grace actually lived in Skokie, north of Chicago. I put the address in my pocket and stood up. Dad, what are you going to do? Terry asked worriedly. There's only one thing I can do, I told him. I need to go and see her. He looked at me humbly. I knew you would say that. He walked me to the door. Dad, don't do anything crazy. I looked at him solemnly. I promise, son. When I got home, I booked a hotel near Grace's address. Then I headed to bed. It's about a 3-hour drive from our house to Chicago, and I wanted to leave early. I had no idea how long I would have to stay here, so I didn't know how much stuff to take with me. While I was driving, I kept thinking about what I wanted to tell her. After 5 years and everything that had happened during that time, I didn't know where to start. I thought through various scenarios. None of them seemed right. There was too much I didn't know. By the time I got to Skokie, it was already midday, so I decided to grab something to eat before heading to her address. I wasn't really that hungry, but I knew the acid building up in my stomach would eat a hole in the lining unless I put something in there to soak it up. When I got to her address, I was surprised. I expected to see slums. Instead, I found myself parked in front of a nice complex filled with what appeared to be upscale townhouses. I was so stunned that when I walked up to the door and rang the bell, I forgot the speech I was going to give to her. I saw an eye looking at me through the peephole of the door, and there was a long pause before it opened. My long-lost daughter stood in the doorway. From an awkward teenager, she grew into a beautiful young woman, as beautiful as her mother. She stood and looked at me with a sour expression on her face. "I should have known better than to trust Terry," was all she said. At this, the anger I had been trying to suppress boiled over, and it was all I could do not to yell at her. In an effort to be in control, I asked rather irritably, "Is this the way to greet your father after he's been missing for 5 years?" She sighed. "You're right, Daddy. I'm so sorry. Please come in." She stepped back, opened the door wider, and I walked into her. It was tastefully decorated, and the furniture looked quite new. The appearance of her lifestyle raised even more questions in my mind. What did she do for a living? How could she afford such a beautiful place? What did she do during her 5 long years of absence? She pointed to the sofa and sat down in the chair opposite me. When I looked at her, it struck me again how much she looked like her mother, and with that memory, all my resentment and anger flared up again. "Why didn't you come home for your mother's funeral?" I demanded. She looked at me helplessly. "Dad, I just couldn't. Everything was so difficult, I just couldn't do it." "This is unacceptable," I said. "For God's sake, she was your mother." Grace just sat there with her eyes downcast. I tried to regain my composure. "She wanted to see you so badly," I said more softly. "Do you know what her last words were?" She said, "Tell Grace I'm so sorry." I angrily brushed away the tears that seemed to form on my cheeks. "I don't know what you two fought about, but it couldn't have been so bad that you didn't even come to watch her be buried." Tears were now streaming down her cheeks. "But I couldn't," she said hopelessly. "If I came back, it would mean that I forgave her. How could I do this?" "Why did you forgive her?" I demanded. "For the way she treated you," she snapped at me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said angrily. "Your mother loved and cared for me every day during our 35 years together. Even when she was dying, she kept telling me this over and over again." Now I could see the anger in Grace's eyes, and it reminded me of the bad old days when she was a rebellious teenager. "Maybe so, Daddy, but she sure had a funny way of showing it." I could only shake my head. "I don't understand a word you're saying," I retorted. She swallowed, and then the words came out. "Dad, she cheated on you. Didn't you know this? Didn't you at least suspect?" I leaned back heavily in my seat. It was difficult for me to breathe. "No, that can't be true. Maddie would never do that. How can you say such a thing?" But there was no convincing in my words. Doubt grew within me even as I protested. "It's true, Daddy. I heard her talking to him on the phone. One day I skipped school, and when my mother came, she didn't know I was at home. I think she had to change for some important event at the museum. But anyway, her cell phone rang, and it was him. I heard her talking to him as she walked around the bedroom, getting out the clothes she wanted to wear. She was talking about what they were going to do that evening, and then she started talking. What she was going to do to him." She sobbed. "Dad, it turned into phone sex, and I heard every dirty word she said." I was reeling from the scene Grace was telling me, and I was grasping at any straw I could find. Maybe it was a joke, honey. Maybe she was just teasing him. But Grace had broken her oath of silence, and now it all had to come out. She interrupted my thoughts. No, Daddy, it was not a joke. I know because the next day when she told me something, I confronted her. She tried to deny it, but when I started repeating what she told him, she had to admit it. I don't know why, maybe she was tired of living with a feeling of guilt, but she told me everything. Who he was, how long it lasted, how it all started. Then the determined expression on her face seemed to disappear and the tears began to flow again. And when she finished, she told me that I could never tell anyone, not Terry, not my friends, and especially not you. She told me that you will never be able to come to terms with this, that you will divorce her and destroy our home. Don't do this, Daddy. I can't break up our family. With these words, she covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Despite my own pain, I walked over and knelt next to her chair to hug her. But I could not remain silent. What she told me raised many more questions. What happened after that? I asked her tenderly. I tried to keep her secret, Daddy, and I think I succeeded for a couple of months. I was about to graduate, and I just wanted to get through it. She looked at me. But it was so hard. Every time she kissed you, the only thing I could think about was what she was doing to him. Every time she had to go to an event at the museum, I wondered if it was just an excuse to see him again. And every time she scolded me for something, I thought, who are you to judge me? She took a napkin and blew her nose. It became so unbearable that I felt like I was going to explode. And then one day, when she really yelled at me, I exploded. That was the time you walked in during our big fight. I knew I couldn't stay there, not even for a day. I couldn't stay with my mother because I couldn't stand her lies and her arrogant attitude. And I couldn't stay with you because I knew that I couldn't hide all this from you, and it would destroy our family. The only way out was for me to leave and go as far as possible. She shrugged. And then I ran away to Chicago. My mind was filled with many questions, but the first one that came out of my mouth was, "Why did you go to Chicago?" She looked at me like I was a fool. "Because that's where he lives." "Who?" I asked angrily. "Who lives where?" "The man she cheated on you with. You heard of him, Dad, Carlton Morrison." And suddenly everything began to fall into place. I had never met Carlton Morrison, but I knew who he was. He was a wealthy commodity trader, known not only for his business successes, but also for his affairs with celebrities and his patronage of the arts. I remembered that his first multimillion-dollar contribution to the museum was one of Maddie's early victories, which marked her as a rising star in the development department. Now I began to wonder what she had to do to get this contribution. Then another memory surfaced. When we were struggling financially, we had a stroke of luck that really changed our situation. Maddie came home one day and told me that her aunt, whom I had never met, had died and left her a significant amount of money. This was enough to allow us to get out of debt and become financially stable. Now I began to wonder who the real source of this money was. But this can't be right, I thought. It was so long ago. I tried to remember when all this happened. This would mean that their romance has begun. But before I could remember, my memories were interrupted by movement coming from the back of the house. Grace jumped up like a shot. "Oh, honey," we woke her up. She then disappeared down the back hallway. When she reappeared, she was accompanied by a beautiful little girl who must have been 2 or 3 years old. She had shiny brown hair that hung in bangs over her forehead and large brown eyes. But all I could focus on at that moment were her abnormally large elbows, the awkward angle of her lower limbs and feet, and the difficulty she had in walking, even with her mother's help. I fell to my knees and reached out to her. "Hello," I said quietly. "I'm your grandfather. What is your name?" Those big eyes looked at me for a moment. Then she said in a broken voice, "Susie." "Hi, Susie. Can I hold you?" She looked back, saw her mother's smile and nodded, then extended her arms towards me. I carefully picked her up and stood there holding my granddaughter. Over her shoulder, I looked at Grace with tear-filled eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was time for Susie to eat, and I did everything I could to help Grace feed her. After that, the little girl wanted to go outside, so Grace took the stroller and put her in it. We then walked along the sunlit sidewalk under the trees until we reached a small park. Susie cooed and talked to herself most of the way. There was a playground in one part of the park, and we watched as half a dozen children played on one of the slides that spiraled down to the ground. One by one, they climbed to the top of the ladder and then let go, spiraling downward until they were thrown to the ground. Exactly like me, I thought with a grin. As we walked, I pointed at the precious little girl in front of us with a questioning expression on my face. Grace understood. "It's cerebral palsy," she told me quietly. I nodded. I didn't know much about CP, but I knew Susie would need special care for the rest of her life. I hugged my daughter. "I'm so sorry, baby." "No need," she replied evenly. "She is my daughter and my responsibility. I have everything under control." I looked at her questioningly, but she seemed confident. Then some of my old anger resurfaced, but I didn't want to alarm Susie, so I tried to keep my voice down. "The least you muggle would do is tell me that I now have a granddaughter." Grace looked at me sadly and then led us to a park bench. She and I sat next to each other, and she gently pushed Susie's stroller back and forth. The combination of the sun and the movement of the stroller seemed to lull Susie back to sleep. After checking on her daughter, Grace turned to me and said with a soft expression, "Poor Dad, you just don't understand. Susie is not your granddaughter." "Of course, she's my granddaughter," I said indignantly. "You are my daughter, and she is your daughter. That makes me her grandfather." She gently took my hand. "You are my dad. You will always be my dad, but you are not my father." I heard a roar in my ears, or maybe it was the distant laughter of the gods. "This can't be true," I gasped. "I was there when you were born. Your mother and I made love." I stopped myself. Even at that moment, it was difficult for me to talk about sex with my daughter. Grace shook her head sadly. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. I saw the DNA test." I couldn't stand it then and cried. Finding my daughter after so long only to lose her again was too much for me. We must have created a strange picture. An elderly man, hunched over, crying bitterly, a young woman hugging him by the shoulders, trying to console him, a baby dozing in her stroller. I tried my best to regain control of myself, but I still couldn't think clearly. "But if I'm not your real father, then who is?" Grace just looked at me, and suddenly all the pieces came together. "When did you find out?" I asked her. "Oh, not much later," she said. I was surprised by this, but that's when Susie started to move. "We should really bring her home," Grace said, and we headed back. We didn't talk. I still had questions, but my grief was too great to ask them right now. Now it became clear to me. The main character of this little tragedy was not Maddie, but me. My role was to be tormented by the gods, taking one blow after another. I thought of the oft-quoted phrase, "Those whom the gods want to destroy, they first drive mad." I could understand it. I felt like I was clinging to sanity by my fingertips. Grace made us a simple dinner, and I helped her feed Susie again. After eating, I held the baby on my lap and read her one of her favorite books. She pointed enthusiastically to the pictures as I read the words on the pages. After putting the girl to bed, Grace and I returned to the living room. My time with Susie had brought me a brief respite from my mental turmoil, but now I needed answers to my questions. I wanted to find out what happened to Grace in the 5 years she disappeared. "Tell me again why you ran away to Chicago," I began. "It was easy, Daddy. I came here because I wanted to see him, to confront the man who had ruined my life and threatened to destroy my family. I had to know what kind of man could force my mother to do what she did." "So, what happened?" I asked. "Well, it was easy to find him. Everyone knew where Carlton Morrison lived. So I simply walked up to his mansion and demanded to meet him. And when I told them I was Maddie Moore's daughter, he let me in." "What did he want to say?" "Oh, he readily admitted that he had been having an affair with his mother for years. He even said that he hopes this romance will continue. He showed absolutely no remorse. I wanted to claw his eyes out. She sighed. But then he started asking about me, why I came, what my plans were. When I admitted that I had no plans, he invited me to live in one of the rooms of his mansion. He told me if I needed money, he would pay me to do odd jobs, and I thought, why not? I had nowhere else to go, and he owed me for the hell he put me through. Besides, I thought that being with him would help me better understand why your mom cheated on you. I shook my head. It's so hard for me to imagine, I told her, that you live in the house of your worst enemy. She smiled sadly. I know, Daddy, but you have to understand, he is a very convincing person. He knows how to flatter you and joke with you until you realize that you are doing what he wants. It's no surprise to me that he could date all these women. Even without his fortune, he is a charming companion. I know, I said quietly. I felt this tension between you, but I never fully understood it. He offered me a job, gave me shelter, and when he found out I was pregnant, he began to support me and Susie. He said he wanted to take care of us. Is he Susie's father? I felt my heart sink, but I had to know the truth. No, Dad, she said, finally looking up at me. I could never allow myself to be with him like that. Susie is the result of one night when I was alone and drunk with some guy from a bar. He was never her father, and I never wanted him in her life. I felt relieved. So you stayed with him just for safety? Yes, she answered. It was difficult, but I couldn't find another way to survive. I wanted to leave, but every time I tried, he found a way to hold me back. He knew that I was afraid to be alone, especially with Susie. Grace, you don't need to be afraid anymore, I said, taking her hand. You can come home. We will support you and Susie. We'll get through this together. She smiled through her tears and nodded. Thank you, Dad. I've been through so much, and I finally feel like I can start living again. We hugged, and I felt the pain and bitterness slowly release from me. It was a long road to healing, but I knew that with my daughter and granddaughter by my side, we could handle it. Life, despite all the blows of fate, still went on, and I was ready to meet it with new hope. After a long and intense conversation, Grace and I decided that the first thing I would do was help her move back. The next day I got up early and started packing my things. The packing process was tedious, but also strangely therapeutic. We spoke little, each of us was immersed in our own thoughts, but our silence was filled with mutual understanding and agreement. We both knew this was an important step for our new beginning. When the morning of the move arrived, I felt a little nervous. We loaded Grace and Susie's things into my car. Grace held Susie in her arms as we said goodbye to her old home. The little girl, not understanding the full significance of the moment, chatted cheerfully in her childish language, bringing us all a little joy. We began our journey back home. The road seemed long, but I was determined to get my daughter and granddaughter back to safety. As we pulled up to the house, I felt a deep sense of relief. It was the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. The first thing I did was make a cozy place for Grace and Susie in our house. I knew it was important for them to feel at home and comfortable in their new surroundings. We spent our first evening together having dinner with our family. Terry and Sally came to us to help us get settled. It was an evening filled with warm memories and hope for the future. In the following weeks, we began to establish a new routine. Grace enrolled Susie in special classes for children with cerebral palsy. I helped her in everything I could. Times were difficult, but I saw our family rally around this new reality. The pastor from our church turned out to be a real support during this time. She helped me find inner peace and accept what happened. We often talked about faith, forgiveness, and love. She taught me that life, despite all the blows of fate, is full of opportunities for healing and a new beginning. Susie turned out to be an amazingly cheerful and inquisitive girl. She brought light and joy into our home that we had lost. Her laughter was like a balm for our wounds, and every day with her was a gift. Grace started a new job at the local library. It was a job she loved, and she felt useful and needed. She found friends and support among her colleagues. I saw her blossom, gradually returning to life. Grace and I continued to talk about the past, trying to understand and accept it. There were moments of pain and tears, but also moments of sincere forgiveness. I realized that her mother, despite her mistakes, still loved us. We decided to keep her memory alive, but not let the past hold us captive. One evening, sitting on the veranda, Grace and I were talking about the future. She expressed a desire to return to school and pursue a degree in social work. I supported her, knowing that this was her calling. We started planning how to make this happen. Over time, our family began to feel a new sense of integrity. Terry and Sally became frequent visitors, and our family was together again. We started planning family outings and events, enjoying every moment spent together. At Christmas that year, we all gathered together at our house. It was a special day full of love and joy. We decorated the tree, exchanged gifts, and took a lot of photos. The evening ended with warm conversations by the fireplace and sweet memories of the past. Life went on, and every day I felt how love and forgiveness helped us grow and heal. We learned to live with the loss, but also found strength for a new beginning. Susie became the center of our universe. Her smile and laughter filled our hearts with joy. As the years passed, I saw my daughter grow into a strong and independent woman. She earned her degree and began working with children with special needs. I was proud of her and her achievements. Susie grew up surrounded by love and care, and I knew that our family would cope with any difficulties. From time to time, we all gathered at the pastor's for prayer meetings and conversations. She always found words of comfort and support for us. Her wisdom and kindness helped us overcome many trials. And then, one day, as I was sitting on the veranda with a cup of tea, I felt inner peace and satisfaction. My family was with me. We overcame so many difficulties and found a new meaning in life. I knew that many more challenges lay ahead, but I was ready to face them with love and faith. At that moment, I realized that life is not only pain and suffering, but also an opportunity for a new beginning, for forgiveness and love. We all make mistakes, but it is important to learn to forgive and move forward. And now, sitting on the veranda, I was ready to face all challenges, knowing that my family is my greatest strength and support. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.